I met Rachel in the most unassuming way possible, at a charity bake sale hosted by our local church. She had flour dusting her sweater sleeves, a mischievous grin, and a talent for coaxing even the gruffest attendees into trying her pecan pies. We were both in our late 20s, and while I'd spent my formative years working long hours to establish my construction business, Rachel had been pursuing her dream of becoming an architect. Our connection was instant, a shared love of building, creating, and envisioning something greater than ourselves. Our courtship was fast and sincere. Within a year, we were married in a quiet ceremony beneath an old oak tree, surrounded by family and friends. Rachel's father, a retired civil engineer, toasted to our formidable partnership in life and work. And for a long time, that's exactly what we were. Rachel designed, and I built. We even co-founded a small firm specializing in custom homes, a venture that thrived thanks to our complementary talents. Rachel's charm often walked a fine line between genuine warmth and the ability to manipulate a room to her advantage. It was a trait I admired at first. She knew how to navigate difficult clients or talk her way into lucrative contracts. But over time, her charisma began to feel like something else, something sharper, more calculated. I brushed off these observations, blaming my own insecurities. After all, Rachel had supported me during some tough times. When my mother passed unexpectedly just 2 years into our marriage, Rachel held our life together while I crumbled. She managed the business, kept the house running, and planned the funeral, all while comforting a husband who spent most of his time locked in his childhood bedroom, mourning a woman he wasn't ready to lose. Her devotion then was enough to silence the tiny voice whispering that her behavior didn't always add up. She worked late on projects for clients who didn't seem to exist. Business trips materialized with little warning, always leaving me to hold down the fort at home. Whenever I asked questions, her answers came quickly, too quickly, as if rehearsed. Yet, each time, I convinced myself that doubt was the real enemy, not Rachel. I carried that faith into the 10th year of our marriage, a milestone we celebrated with a weekend getaway to Asheville. The mountains were Rachel's idea, an escape from the stress of running our growing business. She was affectionate, attentive, and more relaxed than I'd seen her in months. By the time we returned home, I'd convinced myself that any unease I'd felt was misplaced. It was just the stress of juggling so much. Or maybe it was me, overanalyzing as usual. Rachel had her quirks, but who didn't? That's what I told myself every time she looked just a little too nervous when her phone buzzed, or when her explanations for a missed call didn't quite line up. The cracks in our foundation weren't new. I just hadn't wanted to look at them too closely. That would change one evening in February, though I wouldn't understand it until much later. Rachel had been preparing for a networking event in Chicago, a 2-day trip she claimed would bring in new clients for the firm. She was rushing out the door when her phone chimed with a text. She didn't notice, or pretended not to, but I did. The message preview flashed across her screen, brief but unmistakable, counting down the hours until I see you. I didn't ask her about it. Not then. Instead, I buried the sinking feeling, telling myself it was nothing. A harmless message from a colleague, maybe even one meant for someone else. That's what love does sometimes. It shields us from the truth we aren't ready to face. Rachel kissed me goodbye with her usual warmth, promising to call when she landed. Her suitcase bumped the edge of the doorframe as she hurried to the car, and she was gone. I stood there for a long time after, staring at the empty driveway, the crack in the windshield of her car still fresh in my mind. It wasn't until much later that I realized how symbolic that crack was, how it mirrored the fragile structure of our marriage, straining under a weight I hadn't fully understood. The night Rachel left for Chicago, I sat in our living room with the TV on mute, the flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. Her absence wasn't unusual. She traveled often for work, but something about this trip unsettled me. The text message I'd seen replayed in my mind like a broken record, each word pressing into my thoughts with growing weight. Rachel had always been protective of her phone. She claimed it was for security reasons. Clients trusted her with sensitive information, after all. I'd accepted that explanation for years. But now, as I stared at my own phone resting on the coffee table, I couldn't shake the sense that there was more to her guardedness than professionalism. I reached for my phone and hesitated. Searching through her life felt wrong, like a betrayal of the trust that was supposed to define our marriage. But trust, I reminded myself, was a two-way street. And if Rachel wasn't holding up her end of it, then what exactly was I trying to preserve? Before I could talk myself out of it, I opened the laptop we shared for work and logged into the email account linked to our business. Rachel's travel itineraries were usually sent there, along with receipts and invoices. Sure enough, the confirmation for her flight to Chicago was waiting in the inbox, dated 2 days prior. Flight 348, departing at 6:30 p.m. The itinerary listed her destination as O'Hare International, with a return flight scheduled for late Friday afternoon. I stared at the screen, willing myself to let it go. Everything seemed legitimate, but my gut wouldn't quiet. I clicked over to her calendar, scrolling through the week's events. 2 meetings were marked, one with a potential client and another with an established contractor she often collaborated with. Nothing unusual. Still, a nagging thought whispered that it was all too perfect, like a stage set to appear convincing. The impulse to check further overwhelmed me. With trembling hands, I navigated to her airline's website and entered her booking reference. The system pulled up the itinerary, and I scanned it for anything out of place. At first, it matched what she'd forwarded to our business email, but something caught my eye at the bottom of the page. An additional passenger. The name Nathan Heller was listed under Rachel's. The name wasn't familiar, but it didn't matter. My heart raced, and my chest felt tight as I stared at the screen, willing it to change. Rachel had never mentioned traveling with anyone, let alone Nathan. If this was business, why hadn't she said anything? I closed the laptop and leaned back, trying to steady my breathing. My mind ran through every possible scenario, each one darker than the last. Maybe it was a last-minute arrangement, someone from the client's side. Or maybe it was nothing. But deep down, I knew those excuses didn't hold up. Rachel's meticulous nature didn't leave room for surprises. If Nathan was important enough to travel with, she would have told me. The hours dragged as I waited for Rachel's call, but it never came. She'd always been punctual about checking in during her trips, and as the clock ticked past midnight, her silence became deafening. In a rare moment of decisiveness, I picked up my phone and called her. The line rang twice before going to voicemail. I tried again and got the same result. My third attempt led to a curt automated message. This number is not accepting calls at this time. I set the phone down, staring at it like it might suddenly explain itself. It didn't. Unable to sleep, I scrolled through social media, half hoping to stumble on a post that might explain where she was or why she hadn't called. It was a desperate move, and it didn't yield much until I checked Rachel's professional profile. She rarely used it, which made her most recent update all the more surprising. She'd posted a photo earlier that evening, captioned simply, "Ready for a productive week in Chicago?" The image was of Rachel in a hotel lobby, smiling in front of a modern art installation I didn't recognize. But it wasn't the setting or her expression that caught my attention. It was the reflection in the mirrored wall behind her. A man stood at the counter, partially obscured but unmistakable in his stance. He was looking directly at Rachel, his body language casual yet personal. I zoomed in, my fingers trembling as I studied the grainy image. His face was too blurred to identify, but my gut told me who it was, Nathan Heller. For the rest of the night, I stayed on the couch, my thoughts unraveling. Rachel had never made me feel like an insecure husband before. But now, for the first time in our 10 years together, I wondered if I'd been naive to trust her so implicitly. The next morning, after a restless few hours of sleep, I decided I couldn't sit in the dark any longer. I called Carl, an old friend who ran a private investigation firm. Carl and I had gone to high school together, and though we drifted apart over the years, I knew I could count on him for discretion. When he picked up, his voice was groggy but familiar. I wasted no time explaining the situation, my words tumbling out in a rush. Carl listened quietly before offering a simple reply, "Send me what you've got, and I'll look into it." By the time I hung up, guilt had settled in like a storm cloud. The idea of surveilling Rachel felt dirty, like stooping to a level I'd never imagined. But the alternative, living with doubt and suspicion, felt worse. If there was nothing to uncover, Carl would confirm it, and I'd apologize to Rachel for doubting her. But if there was something, I needed to know. Because whatever was happening between Rachel and Nathan Heller, it had already started to chip away at the life we'd built. The days that followed felt like navigating a fog. I went through the motions of work, meeting clients and supervising projects, but my mind was consumed by the unknown. Each time my phone buzzed, my stomach clenched, half expecting a call from Carl with answers I wasn't sure I wanted. Rachel's trip stretched on as planned, and when she finally called Thursday night, her voice was breezy, carrying the warmth of someone with nothing to hide. She apologized for not checking in sooner, blaming late meetings and poor cell service, a claim that would have been plausible if not for everything I'd uncovered. I played along, asking polite questions about her trip and laughing at her stories, all while clenching the phone so tightly my hand ached. The moment we hung up, I forwarded the details of our conversation to Carl. Every detail mattered now, no matter how small. Friday arrived, and with it came Rachel. She pulled into the driveway in her silver sedan, stepping out with her usual effortless grace, her overnight bag slung over her shoulder. I watched from the window, heart pounding as she smiled at the neighbor's dog before unlocking the front door. For a moment, I thought about confronting her right then, throwing the name Nathan Heller into the air and watching for her reaction. But Carl's advice echoed in my mind. Don't act on instinct. Wait for the full picture. Rachel greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, her lips warm and familiar, and I wondered how many times she'd done this while hiding something beneath the surface. She asked about my week, and I offered vague responses, claiming work had kept me busy. When I asked about Chicago, she recounted the same stories she'd told over the phone, her words seamless and well-practiced. Later that evening, as Rachel unpacked her suitcase, I noticed something strange. Among her neatly folded clothes was a small gift bag adorned with a boutique logo I didn't recognize. I asked her about it casually, and she smiled, saying it was a souvenir she'd picked up for her mother. The explanation was innocent enough, but the lie hung in the air like smoke. Rachel and her mother had never been close. She hadn't spoken to her in over a year. I didn't press her on it. Instead, I cataloged it mentally, another thread to add to the tangled web of suspicion. The weekend passed uneventfully, with Rachel slipping effortlessly back into our routine. She made breakfast Saturday morning, her cheerful humming filling the kitchen as she flipped pancakes. Later, we worked in the yard, tackling the overgrown flower beds we'd neglected for weeks. It was all so normal, so painfully familiar, that for a moment, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined everything. But that illusion shattered Monday morning when Carl called. "I've got something," he said, his voice clipped. I left the house under the pretense of running errands and drove to Carl's office on the edge of town. His workspace was as cluttered as I remembered, the walls covered in photographs, maps, and timelines from old cases. He motioned for me to sit, handing me a folder without preamble. Inside were photos, emails, and flight records, evidence so damning it made my breath catch. Rachel and Nathan Heller hadn't just shared a flight to Chicago. They'd checked into the same hotel. The photos Carl had captured showed them together in the lobby, at a restaurant, and walking hand-in-hand through Millennium Park. There was nothing ambiguous about their body language. The way Nathan leaned in close, the way Rachel smiled at him. It was personal, familiar. "Do you recognize this guy?" Carl asked, sliding a headshot across the desk. It was Nathan, his face clearer than in Rachel's earlier post. He had sharp features and a polished demeanor, the kind of man who looked like he belonged in boardrooms and glossy magazine spreads. I shook my head. "No, but he's clearly more than a coworker." Carl nodded. "He's not just anyone. Heller's the owner of a development firm based out of Chicago. Big money, big projects. He's well-connected. If I had to guess, they met through work." I clenched my fists, the weight of the betrayal crashing down on me. Rachel hadn't just been unfaithful. She'd done it with a man who could directly benefit from our business. The implications were staggering. "Is there more?" I asked, my voice tight. Carl hesitated before pulling out a second folder. "I wasn't sure if I should show you this, but you need to see it." I flipped it open and immediately felt sick. It was a timeline of transactions linked to Rachel's personal account, showing large sums withdrawn during her business trips. The money had gone to luxury hotels, fine dining, and even gifts from high-end boutiques, the same boutique logo I'd seen on her souvenir bag. Did she pay for all this? I asked, my voice a mix of anger and disbelief. Some of it, Carl said, but not all. Heller seems to have covered the rest. I closed the folder, my head spinning. Rachel hadn't just betrayed me emotionally. She'd used our shared resources to fund her affair. The woman I thought I knew, the woman who had helped build my life, had dismantled it in secret, brick by brick. Carl studied me carefully. What's your next move? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stared at the folders in front of me, their contents heavy with undeniable proof. There was no going back from this, no way to unsee what I'd learned. I need to think, I said finally, my voice hollow. Carl nodded, leaning back in his chair. Take your time, but don't wait too long. This guy's not the type to back down if things get messy. I left the office feeling like the ground beneath me had shifted. The woman I loved, the life we'd built, it all felt like a carefully constructed lie. As I drove home, one thought consumed me. Rachel might have been the architect of our business, but I'd be the one to decide how it came crumbling down. When I got home that evening, the house felt smaller, suffocating, as if the very walls had absorbed the weight of what I'd learned. Rachel was in the kitchen, her back to me as she prepared dinner. The soft clatter of utensils and the faint aroma of garlic should have been comforting, but instead, it felt like a cruel mockery of normalcy. I watched her for a moment, taking in the effortless way she moved, completely unaware that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling. My mind reeled with questions. How long had this been going on? What was real, and what was just another piece of the lie? The thought of confronting her then, of seeing the truth reflected in her eyes, made my stomach churn. Instead, I forced myself to act natural, joining her at the table when she called me in. She set down a plate of pasta and poured us each a glass of wine, her smile radiant, her tone light as she asked about my day. I answered in vague phrases, doing my best to mask the bitterness rising in my throat. Every bite of food felt like swallowing stones, every word exchanged an exercise in restraint. As the evening wore on, I caught myself studying her, looking for cracks in her armor. I noticed the way she avoided eye contact when I mentioned the business or our shared plans for the future. Her laugh seemed a little too bright, her gestures a little too rehearsed. These were things I'd never noticed before, or perhaps I'd chosen not to. When she finally went to bed, I stayed behind in the living room, staring at the folders Carl had given me. The photos, the records, the undeniable proof of her betrayal. They felt heavier now, their presence a silent accusation. I couldn't keep them in the house. Not yet. I stuffed them into a box and locked it in the trunk of my truck, as if putting them out of sight might also put them out of mind. But sleep didn't come that night. Instead, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the ticking of the clock growing louder with each passing minute. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with him, laughing, holding hands, sharing the kind of intimacy I thought was ours alone. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed more information, more clarity. Confronting her without a plan felt like walking into battle unarmed. If Rachel could lie so easily, I had no doubt she'd find a way to twist the situation, to paint me as paranoid or overbearing. So, I reached out to Carl again. This time, my instructions were specific. I wanted to know everything about Nathan Heller, his life, his connections, and, most importantly, his role in Rachel's life. If Rachel had a pattern, if this affair was part of something larger, I needed to know before I made my next move. Carl agreed, but his tone carried a note of caution. Be careful, man, he said. The more you dig, the harder it gets to climb out. The next few days were a blur of forced normalcy. Rachel carried on as if nothing had changed, her days filled with client meetings and design sketches, her nights spent beside me in the bed we once shared without doubt. I found myself hyper-aware of every interaction, every text she sent, every call she made. She was careful, but not careful enough. It was during one of those moments, when she left her phone unattended in the kitchen, that I found the opening I'd been waiting for. She'd received a notification from an unfamiliar messaging app, the kind she'd never used before. My pulse quickened as I tapped the screen, expecting it to be locked. To my surprise, it wasn't. The app opened to a thread of messages between Rachel and Nathan, their conversation as damning as it was personal. They spoke of their time in Chicago, their plans for the next trip, and, worst of all, their shared disdain for the mundane realities of married life. Nathan's messages were laced with charm, but Rachel's responses cut the deepest. She spoke of how alive she felt with him, how her time with me felt like living in grayscale. I copied the messages to my phone, my hands trembling as I scrolled through the thread. The evidence was undeniable now. Rachel wasn't just straying. She was building a life with Nathan, one that didn't include me. That evening, Carl called with an update. Nathan Heller wasn't just another client or business connection. He was a competitor, one who had recently launched a bid on a project Rachel had been overseeing for months. If their relationship was more than personal, if Nathan had used their affair to gain leverage over our business, the implications were staggering. "Do you think she's feeding him information?" I asked, my voice strained. "I can't say for sure," Carl replied. "But it wouldn't be the first time someone's used a relationship to get ahead. Keep your guard up." I hung up the phone, my chest tight with anger and disbelief. Rachel hadn't just betrayed me as her husband. She'd jeopardized everything we'd built together. Our business, our reputation, our future. It was all at risk now. And for what? For a man who could walk away the moment it suited him. That night, as Rachel slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, a storm of emotions raging within me. The love I'd once felt for her, the trust I'd placed in her. It was all unraveling, thread by thread. I knew I couldn't wait much longer. The walls were closing in, and soon, the life we'd built would come crashing down. The only question was how much of it I'd let her destroy before I stopped her. The tension between Rachel and me grew heavier with each passing day, though she seemed blissfully unaware. I carried the weight of what I knew in silence, every moment with her feeling like standing on the edge of a collapsing bridge. The evidence Carl had gathered was definitive, the messages from Nathan damning, but still, I hesitated. Confrontation was inevitable, but timing was everything. I needed it to be on my terms, not hers. Rachel had always been sharp, and the closer I came to acting, the more I noticed her shifts. A slight wariness in her gaze, the way her conversations became more surface level, avoiding depth. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. She was playing a part, just as I was, and it became a silent game of who would break first. Then came the email. It arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, sent to our shared business address. I was at the office, poring over blueprints for a new project, when the notification flashed across my screen. The sender was Nathan Heller. The subject line read, "Proposal Follow-Up," a mundane enough heading to avoid suspicion. But the email itself was anything but mundane. It outlined a detailed strategy for a joint venture between his firm and ours, complete with projections, profit-sharing terms, and a tentative timeline. The pitch was polished, enticing, and wholly unexpected. At the end of the email, there was a personal note. "Rachel, looking forward to discussing this further during your trip next month. Best, Nathan." I stared at the screen, anger and disbelief swirling inside me. She hadn't mentioned anything about another trip. The email wasn't just a proposal. It was a blatant reminder of their connection. Whatever lines Rachel had crossed in her personal life were now spilling into our business, into my domain. I forwarded the email to Carl immediately, adding a single question. "Can you track this?" His reply came within minutes. "Already on it. This is good leverage. Let me see what else I can dig up." I closed my laptop, my hands shaking. Nathan's arrogance was staggering, his tone as if I didn't exist, as if I were just another piece of collateral damage in their carefully orchestrated affair. The proposal wasn't just a business move. It was a power play, one that threatened to dismantle everything Rachel and I had built together. That night, I decided to take the first step toward confrontation. Rachel was in the living room when I got home, curled up on the couch with a glass of wine and a book. She looked up as I walked in, her smile warm but tinged with hesitation. I kissed her on the cheek, the gesture hollow, and excused myself to the bedroom. From the closet, I retrieved the box of evidence Carl had compiled. I brought it into the kitchen, laying its contents out on the table with a precision that felt almost surgical. Photos, emails, flight records, financial statements, all of it laid bare under the harsh glare of the overhead light. Rachel came in minutes later, her steps faltering as she saw the display. Her wineglass trembled in her hand, and her face paled. "What's this?" she asked, her voice tight. I didn't look up. Instead, I slid the photo of her and Nathan at Millennium Park toward her. "Tell me about him." She hesitated, the silence stretching unbearably. "He's a client," she said finally, her tone defensive. "We've been collaborating on some projects." "Stop," I said, cutting her off. My voice was calm, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. "I know, Rachel. I know about the flights, the hotel rooms, the money you've spent. I know about the messages and the meetings and every lie you've told me. So, please, don't insult me by pretending this is business." Her hand went to her mouth, her eyes wide with something between shock and panic. For the first time, I saw her mask slip, the composure she'd always prided herself on crumbling under the weight of the truth. "I can explain," she stammered, setting the wineglass down with a shaky hand. "Explain what?" I asked, standing now, the anger I'd been holding back rising to the surface. "That you've been sleeping with a man who's using you to undercut our business? That you've been lying to my face every single day? What exactly can you explain, Rachel?" Tears welled in her eyes, but they did nothing to move me. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she said, her voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt you." "But you did," I snapped. "Over and over again. Every time you lied. Every time you snuck off to meet him. You didn't just hurt me, Rachel. You destroyed everything we built. Everything I thought we were." She sank into the chair opposite me, her hands shaking as she reached for the stack of photos. "I wasn't thinking," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It started as work, but then you made a choice," I said coldly. "You chose him. You chose this. And now you're going to live with the consequences." She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "What are you going to do?" I leaned forward, my hands flat on the table, my gaze unwavering. "I'm going to make sure he doesn't take a single thing from me. Not my business, not my life, and certainly not my dignity. As for you, Rachel," I paused, the words catching in my throat. I don't know if there's anything left to save. The weight of those words hung between us, a chasm that neither of us could cross. She buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled, but I felt no pity. Not yet. Not while the wounds were still raw. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her to sit alone with the wreckage of her choices. Upstairs, I locked the bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. The confrontation was over, but the battle was just beginning. I spent that night in the guest room, the bed unfamiliar and unwelcoming, much like the life I now faced. The confrontation had stripped away the pretense that Rachel and I could continue living as we had, but the question remained. What came next? The truth had been laid bare, yet the path forward felt murky, tangled in a web of anger, betrayal, and unresolved emotion. In the hours before dawn, I scrolled through the evidence Carl had gathered, each piece feeling heavier than the last. The photos were damning, but it was the messages between Rachel and Nathan that stung the most. They weren't just lovers. They were accomplices, building something at my expense. Each word, each plan they made, was a knife twisting deeper. It wasn't just about love or lust. It was about control, about power. By morning, my anger had hardened into resolve. I needed to act, not just for myself, but to protect everything I'd built. The business, our shared assets, my reputation. Rachel and Nathan couldn't walk away unscathed while leaving me in ruins. This wasn't just a matter of the heart anymore. It was a battle, and I intended to win. I began by calling Carl, updating him on the confrontation and the email I'd received from Nathan. His response was measured, professional. He assured me the evidence we had was more than sufficient to take legal action if it came to that. He offered to loop in a lawyer he trusted, someone skilled in high-stakes divorce and corporate disputes. I agreed without hesitation. The rest of the day was a blur of phone calls and meetings. I consulted with the lawyer Carl recommended, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Amanda who laid out the options in stark terms. The evidence of Rachel's affair wasn't just a personal betrayal. It could be leveraged in the business dissolution and the divorce. Nathan's involvement added another layer, one that could potentially damage his firm's reputation if exposed. Amanda's advice was clear. Document everything, keep my emotions in check, and be prepared for a drawn-out fight. Returning home that evening felt surreal. Rachel was there, of course, her presence a painful reminder of the life we'd shared and the future we'd lost. She was quiet, subdued, as if unsure how to navigate this new reality. I avoided her, retreating to the office to review the financial records Amanda had asked me to compile. Every transaction, every invoice, felt like uncovering a new betrayal. There were patterns in the spending I hadn't noticed before, trips that coincided with her business travel, unexplained withdrawals, charges from high-end stores I'd never heard of. I thought back to the beginning, to when Rachel and I had started this journey together. Back then, every dollar had mattered. We'd scrimped and saved, building the business from the ground up. I'd worked grueling hours in the field while she handled the design work. Our partnership seamless, or so I believed. Now, looking at the numbers, it was clear that somewhere along the way, she'd started prioritizing something, or someone else. As the days passed, Rachel made attempts to talk, to explain, but I wasn't ready. Each time she approached, I shut her down with silence or a curt response, the weight of her actions too fresh to allow for reconciliation. I could see the regret in her eyes, but it wasn't enough. Regret didn't undo the lies. It didn't rebuild trust. Carl's updates continued to roll in, each one painting a clearer picture of Nathan Heller. He was ambitious, charismatic, and ruthless, qualities that had served him well in his rise to success but left a trail of burned bridges in their wake. His firm had a reputation for poaching clients and exploiting smaller competitors, tactics I now saw mirrored in his relationship with Rachel. She wasn't just his lover. She was a pawn in his larger game, a way to infiltrate and destabilize our business. The realization both infuriated and saddened me. Rachel had always been intelligent, capable, but with Nathan, she'd allowed herself to be used. Whether she saw it that way or not, I couldn't say, and part of me didn't care. The damage was done. The tipping point came a week later when I received a call from Amanda. She'd intercepted an inquiry from one of our clients, a longtime partner who had been approached by Nathan's firm with a proposal eerily similar to one of our own. The client, loyal to me, had tipped Amanda off, and she wasted no time connecting the dots. Nathan wasn't just pursuing Rachel. He was actively targeting our business, using her as a conduit. The betrayal was complete. Rachel hadn't just been unfaithful. She'd crossed professional lines, risking everything we'd built together. That night, as I sat alone in the office, I made a decision. This wasn't just about ending a marriage or dissolving a business. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my future. I drafted a letter to Rachel, laying out my terms. The marriage was over, and so was our professional partnership. I would fight for control of the business, using every piece of evidence at my disposal to ensure Nathan's involvement couldn't be swept under the rug. There would be no second chances, no opportunities for reconciliation. The letter was clinical, devoid of emotion, because I had none left to give. When I handed it to her the next morning, she read it in silence, her face pale and drawn. She didn't argue or protest, and I didn't wait for her to. I walked away, the sound of the front door closing behind me as final as the words I'd written. The foundation of our life together had crumbled, but for the first time in weeks, I felt steady. The road ahead would be long, but at least it was mine to navigate. Rachel and Nathan had taken so much from me, but they wouldn't take everything. I wouldn't let them. The legal process unfolded like a storm, sudden, chaotic, and destructive. Rachel had tried to approach me a few times after receiving my letter, her tone softer, her words pleading. I'd shut her down each time, refusing to engage beyond what was necessary. Her apologies felt hollow, like bandages over a wound too deep to heal. The divorce filings were swift, thanks to Amanda's efficiency. The evidence Carl had gathered left little room for negotiation, and Rachel's initial attempts to defend herself faltered under the weight of proof. Her affair wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage, but a professional liability that tied her to Nathan's schemes. The court took a dim view of it, and the scales tipped heavily in my favor. Nathan, unsurprisingly, had disappeared from the narrative. Whatever promises he'd made to Rachel about their future together evaporated the moment things got messy. Reports surfaced of him distancing himself publicly, refusing to answer inquiries about their relationship or the proposals his firm had made. He was shrewd enough to know when to cut his losses, leaving Rachel to bear the fallout alone. The business, the crown jewel of our partnership, became the central battleground. I'd been prepared to lose it, to walk away and start fresh if necessary, but Amanda fought tooth and nail to keep it intact. She highlighted Nathan's interference, the financial irregularities, and Rachel's misuse of company funds. By the end, the court ruled in my favor, granting me sole ownership. Rachel was removed from the business entirely, a decision that left her visibly shaken when it was announced. Afterward, the house felt emptier than ever. Rachel had moved out weeks before, taking only what the settlement allowed. The silence was deafening, and for a while, I avoided the rooms where her presence lingered most. The office where we'd worked side by side, the kitchen where we'd shared late-night meals, even the garden she'd once tended with care. It was as though the life we'd built together had been erased, leaving only shadows. But slowly, the pieces of my life began to realign. The business stabilized, thanks in part to the loyalty of our team and clients. Amanda had worked behind the scenes to ensure the damage Nathan's firm had caused was mitigated. One by one, I reached out to the clients he'd tried to poach, reassuring them of my commitment to their projects. Most stayed, some out of loyalty, others because they saw how fiercely I was fighting to rebuild. Carl called me one evening, weeks after the dust had settled. He wanted to check in, to see how I was holding up. I told him the truth. I wasn't fine, but I was better. The anger that had once consumed me had started to fade, replaced by a cautious optimism. For the first time in years, my life felt like my own. As for Rachel, I hadn't heard from her since the court finalized everything. Mutual friends told me she was struggling, working freelance projects to stay afloat. Nathan, they said, had severed all ties, leaving her to face the consequences alone. There was no satisfaction in hearing that. If anything, it deepened the sadness I felt for what we'd lost. I'd loved Rachel once, deeply and without question. Now, I could barely recognize the woman she'd become. One evening, I stood in the garden, the sun setting over the horizon. The flower beds Rachel had tended were overgrown, weeds creeping through the soil. I knelt down and began pulling them out, one by one, clearing the space for something new to grow. It was slow, tedious work, but it felt right. There was no rushing this, no shortcut to healing. As the days turned into weeks and then months, the life I'd built with Rachel became a memory, one I carried with me but no longer allowed to define me. The business thrived, my connections deepened, and the pain that had once felt insurmountable became something quieter, something manageable. In the end, it wasn't about rebuilding what I'd lost. It was about building something entirely new, a life untethered from betrayal, filled with the promise of something better. And as I stood there in the garden, the last remnants of Rachel's influence cleared away, I realized I wasn't just moving on. I was moving forward.